Look, Donald Trump insulting me is a badge of honor for me, but I think we all know, as both as an educator for a couple decades and as a parent, using that term is just so damaging. It's hurtful.
More than 400 employees of the Minnesota Department of Human Services accusing Governor Tim Walz of failing to act on widespread fraud warnings and then retaliating against whistleblowers. That department writing on X, quote, Tim Walz is 100% responsible for massive fraud in Minnesota. We let Tim Walz know of fraud early on, hoping for a partnership in stopping fraud, but no, we got the opposite response. Tim Walz systematically retaliated against whistleblowers using monitoring, threats, repression, and did his best to discredit fraud reports.
Well, folks, it looks like we may have called this, didn't we? Because it turns out now that Governor Tim Walz may have known a lot more about the widespread fraud problem in his state, coming largely from members of the Somali migrant diaspora, than he initially let on. Of course, yesterday he was going on national television and telling us that actually he arrested these Somali criminals and he's pro-law and order, even though he sat back and didn't do anything. But it now turns out that over 400 employees of the Minnesota Department of Human Services, this is an agency that has dealt a lot, for instance, with the fake housing stabilization projects that are basically these welfare scheme frauds to send a bunch of money back to Somalia, is now accusing Governor Tim Walz of failing to act on widespread fraud warnings and retaliating against whistleblowers. So in other words, not only was he turning a blind eye to it, he may have even actively tried to shut down anyone actually going after the fraud, right? Now, guys, I hate to make the same point over and over again, because I think we've said this in the past 2 videos on the subject, but it's actually just important to understand here, so let me say it again, that anytime you have a situation like Minneapolis, in other words, the city has become a huge hub of money laundering and financial fraud, and it's basically almost like the finances are run, you could say, by a form of a mafia, it's very rare that the local politicians are not in on it. That is almost never how it works in American history. Now, of course, that's what the Democrats and Tim Walz are now trying to claim, right? We have nothing to do with this. Actually, we cracked down on fraud. Well, why is the DHS now pointing out that you ignored the fraud and you retaliated against whistleblowers? Because, ladies and gentlemen, as I've been saying, right? I'm part Italian. Italian Americans can totally attest to this, right? Anytime, for instance, in American history where the mob and the mafia are running the Northeast, the local politicians are always in on that type of stuff, okay? And I don't think it's any coincidence that Minnesota, first of all, is a Democrat state, but secondly, is a state where the Somali community, the diaspora where a lot of these problems are happening, are some of the heaviest Democrat voters in the entire state. Why is that? Because not only does probably Governor Tim Walz understand that, oh, well, I'm going to ignore the fraud because that way the Somali voters will keep electing us. But who knows? It's totally possible as well. He may be getting some corruption on the back end. I think that's already been a proven fact that's known to be happening within the state legislature. Could totally be possible here with the governor. I don't think it's shocking to think after noticing this, but nonetheless, we'll tell you all about this story here today. And again, just proving the exact point that we've been trying to make. The politicians always know. They always know. Look at New York City. Look at the Northeast throughout much of the 19 and 1800s. It's always been corrupt. There's this political machine from a migrant or immigrant community where there's a lot of crime also going on. And then coincidentally, they like the party that ignores the crime. Yeah, it's one big scheme. So we'll get into it, guys. First, though, do us a favor. If you enjoy our content, make sure you hit that like button down below and subscribe to the channel if you are new. That is not only the best way to support our work, but it also ensures that you can stay up to date with all the latest news and coverage. And that said, before we get in exactly to what the Minnesota DHS is currently telling us, I want to remind everyone what we reacted to yesterday, where Tim Walz was, of course, going on TV pretending to be this law and order governor, because yes, that's something we all associate Minneapolis and Minnesota with. And then secondly, trying to take credit for arresting the fraudsters, even though I again repeat here, they were federal indictments, not state indictments. But take a listen. Here's him just hours before the DHS fact checks him.
Dozens of people of East African descent have been charged, convicted, and sentenced for stealing more than $1 billion in taxpayer money from government programs during COVID. As you know, Governor, that is more than Minnesota spends each year to run its Department of Corrections. So I want to give you a chance to respond to this. Do you take responsibility for failing to stop this fraud in your state?
Well, certainly I take responsibility for putting people in jail. Governors don't get to just talk theoretically. We have to solve problems. And I will note, it's not just Somalis. Minnesota is a generous state. Minnesota is a prosperous state, a well-run state. We're AAA bond rated, but that attracts criminals. Those people are going to jail. We're doing everything we can. But to demonize an entire community on the actions of a few, it's lazy.
Yeah, so there you have Tim Walz both taking credit for arresting the criminals when he quite literally did not, and secondly, trying to make the odd argument, I don't know, that apparently because Minnesota is such a well-run and financially strong state that encourages criminals to take advantage of it. I would think that if your systems are secure, that should discourage criminals. It's almost like you're this wide open place that it would be, I don't know, very easy to fraud the government. I don't know. Is that a crazy piece of conjecture to have? I'm not exactly sure. But nonetheless, here is now the story here today. More than 400 employees of the Minnesota Department of Human Services accuse Governor Tim Walz of failing to act on widespread fraud warnings and retaliating against whistleblowers. The Minnesota Department of Human Services employees account, so I'd guess basically the union here, which says it consists of more than 480 current staff members at Minnesota DHS, wrote on X that Walz is, quote, 100% responsible for massive fraud in Minnesota. We again repeat here, guys, it shouldn't be that surprising considering he got elected as the governor on the backs of guess whose vote, right? But anyways, we let Tim Walz know of fraud early on, hoping for a partnership in stopping the fraud, but no, we got the opposite response. Tim Walz systematically retaliated against whistleblowers using monitoring, threats, repression, and did his best to discredit fraud reports. That's interesting too. Doesn't that sound like something out of, let's say, an early 1900s movie where the mayor who's corrupt and bought out by the mafia is trying to like silence the local newspaper guy? Yeah, it's almost because these types of things never change. Okay, it was true back then that when you have that stuff going on at the local level, the politicians know. I would argue it's still true today, right? Even in the case of, say, high crime cities, you have the George Soros DAs making some baffling decisions like, hey, this guy's been arrested 20 times, 40 times, even 70 times. Let's keep on letting them out of jail. That you don't think in those systems that are constantly enabling the criminals, there is no connection between the politicians and the criminals? I mean, you know, we look at a country like Mexico where that's a known fact, right? The cartel owns the entire country, essentially. They buy out all the politicians. They assassinate ones and take ones out of power that are actually doing something about it. You look at that and say, okay, you know, do you think America is immune from the same problems that, again, have been true for like most of history? Absolutely not. And I think that's still the case here, right? So when you look at a political party in this country who continually enables crime, do not think to yourself that is simply out of naivety or ignorance, okay? I'm just saying, there are sometimes reasons there that are connected to the fact that they're in with the criminals in one way or another, nonetheless. In addition to retaliating against whistleblowers, Tim Walz disempowered the office of the legislative auditor. Why would he not want to have an auditor? That's very interesting. Allowing agencies to disregard their audit findings and guidance. And as I read all of this, I'm also thinking to myself, you're noticing something of a pattern here with Tim Walz, because do you remember, I should say, how visibly and almost in a very deranged and defensive sense how mad he got over Doge? And it's like, what was that all about, right?
Saying on my phone, I don't know, some of you know this on the iPhone, they've got that little stock app. I added Tesla to it to give me a little boost during the day. 225 and dropping. So, and if you own one, we're not blaming you. You can take dental floss and pull the Tesla thing off, you know, and take out just...
looking back, I think there's something going on there. Because sure, Democrats were pretty unanimously up in arms about Doge, and certainly they oppose everything that Trump does. But notice how that was like Tim Walz's issue. That's where he was doing the town halls. He was rallying around the country. He's making very explosive statements. And then ever since that issue has kind of left the spotlight, Democrats are still getting pissed about other things. Tim Walz kind of quietly retreated. It's almost like the Doge thing is what he cared about the most. And why is that? Because Doge was primarily a project to get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse, mainly within our government workforce, right? Where apparently you look at how Tim Walz is running his own state, a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse. It's almost like that's his entire business model, right? And that's precisely why, again, he got so defensive. Now, I'm sure that's true of a lot of other Democrats as well. I'm just pointing out, you look at the guy who made Doge his top issue, you can't write that. You can't make that up, right? This is exactly how he governs, his own state government. Nonetheless, Walz's office has yet to immediately respond to Fox News for comment, but apparently the group claims here, the group's claims, I should say, come as federal prosecutors continue to unravel one of the nation's largest COVID-era fraud cases, which, of course, Tim Walz said we should not do. We should not look for fraud. But then when the federal government, when the Trump administration arrests people for committing fraud, he, of course, takes the credit and says, I did that. No, you didn't do anything. Now, the DOJ has now announced charges last week against now 78 defendants in the Feeding Our Future fraud scheme, which prosecutors say involve more than $250 million in stolen funds from a federally funded child nutrition program and has already resulted in over 50 convictions. Many of the individuals charged come from Minnesota's Somali community. And casual reminder, it's widely being speculated and investigated right now. A lot of this money from Feeding Our Futures was likely going to Al-Shabaab, which is an Al-Qaeda-linked terrorist group in Somalia. But according to Tim Walz, I don't know, is that what he supports as well? But nonetheless, yep, this is the exact situation that you're dealing with. Walz addressed the fraud allegations and now, I guess, proof, right? At a press conference last week, saying that it, quote, undermines trust in government and undermines programs that are absolutely critical in improving quality of life. If you're committing fraud, no matter where you come from, what you look like, what you believe, you are going to jail, said Governor Tim Walz. But clearly, that's not the case in your state. The federal government has to go in and do that job for you, don't they?
He's sorry for making crime and, something that we need to address in Minneapolis. Dustin.
Yeah, and to your point and what Chris has stated, it all comes down to a lot of the time, people are afraid of being called a racist. This goes all the way back to Omar Fattah, even with Feeding Our Future. When you look back at that time, Tim Walz had the ability to do stop payments on Feeding Our Future before they stole $250 million. Omar Fattah actually ended up going out there publicly and stating that it's because our state government is actually racist. And they ended up vying through that. And if you look at Minnesota in our 2022 election, we actually had 2 statewide seats come within 1 percentage point of actually winning for Republicans. So when we're talking about 100,000 Somalis in the Somali community, but only tens of thousands of votes being the margin of victory for Republicans, that's a voter base you simply don't want to upset. But now what has it gotten to us? We are going back to, 2014 when this all started? Yeah. 2018 is when Walz enters office. But
it gets worse.
We're not talking about hundreds of millions. We're talking about billions at this point. And whistleblowers within DHS in Minnesota predict that it could exceed $6 billion, not just $2 billion that's been discovered so far.
Dustin, this is crazy. I mean, this is what we imported when we brought in a massive number of Somali refugees.
Yeah, and on that note, I again say this should have been pretty easy to see coming. Because we even reported in the past when it came to Omar Fattah, that is, of course, the Captain Phillips-looking guy that tried to be the mayor of Minneapolis, that he had his own allegations and potential fraud scheme going on here where he basically passed funding while he was in the state legislature to enrich and give money to a housing stabilization company. A lot of fraud in this housing stuff, by the way, going on in Minneapolis that was owned directly by his wife. So he's basically using politics to enrich his own family. And in that very situation, the information was given, or I guess reported by the Minnesota DHS, the very agency now that's accusing Tim Walz of turning a blind eye to fraud. But as you can clearly tell, nothing was really done about it. And Omar was still able to run for mayor and lose based on tribal warfare to this very day. So understand, I mean, when you're dealing with a situation where clearly a bunch of the state legislature is in on it, local politicians are in on it, it's not a crazy thing to say, yeah, I would think too, the governor is also in on it.
It's March 24th, 2025, and Senator Omar Fateh is the sole author of a bill he says will speed up access for people to be approved for HSS, a Medicaid-funded program to help the elderly and disabled find and maintain housing.
HSS is a lifeline.
A lifeline moving too slow, the senator says, because at DHS, there was a months-long enrollment backlog as the agency was overwhelmed by the number of people being signed up.
Delays that are putting people at risk of eviction, extended homelessness, and service lapses.
What was not known at the time was that Senator Fateh had an undisclosed tie to the HSS industry. Fateh's campaign staff says his wife no longer owned the company, which had not started billing Medicaid when he introduced the legislation. They point to this handwritten note in Secretary of State records dated April of 2024 that states Kaltu Mohammed is no longer associated with the company. However, a Secretary of State spokesperson tells KARE 11 this document does not remove someone from a company. And more than a year later, just 4 days after KARE 11's investigation exposed allegations of widespread fraud in the HSS program, this record, listing the senator's wife as a current owner of Community Development Services, LLC, was filed with DHS. The record, electronically signed by her and dated May 5th, 2025, transferred full ownership of the HSS company to her business partner.
Yeah, so I don't want to make any definitive statements because this has not been proven in a court of law. It's not even been taken to a court of law. But it seems pretty clear to me and any person with common sense, yeah, that was all done for plausible deniability. It's obvious corruption. Some handwritten note saying, my wife is no longer associated with the company. Even though the legal filings still show that, and then once the accusations come out, that's when they go to change who's the actual owner of the company. It's ridiculous. And of course, again, Omar Fateh is the most famous one. He's far from the only individual in the state legislature who's engaged in some type of scheme like this. We've seen it time and again. I would like to bring up to people, I think there's a misconception right now in Minneapolis with the Somali community that there's only that one feeding our futures fraud case going on with the 70 indictments. I've been pointing this out because we talked about a few different ones, right? That's the most notable one, sure. That's the biggest one. But it's not the only one. There's a ton of this, a ton of different indictments right now going on because there is such a widespread culture of fraud in that community that I again say there's no way this is just a couple people doing something without everyone else knowing. Everyone knows what's going on. The fellow members of the Somali community know what's going on. They're likely saying nothing about it. They're not being snitches. The local politicians who are getting elected by that community absolutely know what's going on. And I find it very convenient, by the way, just about 3 days ago, another example of this. Right before the Minnesota DHS comes out against what Tim Walz is saying, that despite his administration going out and saying, oh, we actually arrest people, we're law and order, we're going to crack down on fraud, very conveniently, Tim Walz's administration had refused to release the records of the Medicaid providers who were accused of fraud. Again, why could that be? Mr. I hate Doge, I hate all this stuff so much, right? Why would you refuse to release those records? Why? Because it's an unfounded allegation? Clearly not, okay? Medicaid fraud is a widespread problem in your state. There's been multiple different indictments brought against it. Why can't the public actually find out what's going on? You're refusing to release the records. I wonder what could be going on there, right? Could it be corruption tied back to your very party? By the way, I think back to the fact that it wasn't just Doge and firing government employees or canceling certain funding. It was also a crackdown on Medicaid fraud that we further saw Democrats get so up in arms about, right? Minnesota DHS whistleblowers have stated that the fraud could exceed $6.5 billion since Tim Walz assumed office. Only $2 billion of it, guys, has been uncovered so far. Now, here's the conundrum, of course, and here's the problem, right? Is that Democrats know exactly what they're doing here, okay? Whether or not even Tim Walz is personally in on the corruption, which I would have a huge amount of speculation that he is, but even if he isn't, there's also kind of a way you can set up a political machine and a voter base by allowing fraud and by allowing widespread government dependency. What exactly do I mean by that? Well, of course, people like free stuff. People especially like free stuff they don't deserve, right? It's like half of the Somali community in the state of Minnesota is winning the lottery every freaking week, just free government contracts to essentially sit around and do nothing. And they understand, and this is exactly why they do it, right? That in elections, that community, which is like 100,000 or so people, it's like more than enough to decide, especially the local Minneapolis races and all that, that people are not going to voluntarily vote for the party that's going to take away the free stuff and their ability to commit fraud, right? Now, historically in America, the only thing stopping us from becoming that, because understand, this is something that destroys a lot of democratic countries, is this kind of mentality of whether it's socialism or kind of just, running around, some crazy despot dictator promises the peasants a bunch of free stuff. They all uprise, and then the dictator just goes crazy, but he's still a hero to the peasants, etc. Again, the only thing preventing that from happening in America was the mentality of rugged individualism, which is a very uniquely American concept, right? The idea I should be self-reliant, pull myself up by my bootstraps. So, there's always been some, cultural shame, in this country to living that way, frauding the government, being on, taxpayer benefits. It's just not seen as very honorable. But of course, what Democrats have further figured out is not only can you make people reliant on the free stuff, but if we run into issues, because let's say native-born Americans do not really like that whole idea, that whole concept, they're turned off by it, that's fine. You can just import people from countries where it's not looked down upon to steal or to, fraud people to get free stuff and, do unethical things. And then therefore, guess what? You have a permanent voting base, right? So, of course, when we talk about ideas like, hey, maybe some cultures, some places are just kind of incompatible with one another, and there's totally a distinction, by the way. There is a difference between a first world Western and a third world non-Western country, that this is even maybe a smaller example of what we're talking about, right? The very idea of how do people view something like taxpayer benefits or fraud or gaming a system, essentially, So just something to consider there. But yeah, again, I don't think it's exactly a huge mystery what's going on here, guys, or exactly why it is happening. But all right, with that said, guys, let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Be sure to leave a like on this video. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. And until next time, God bless and peace.